This chapter we have the biblical record and account of a giant by the name of Goliath coming against Israel, and how a shepherd boy by the name of David slew and conquered him. Of course, it is one of the best known biblical accounts. It is something magnificent and spectacular and very impactful event, so much more than a children's Bible story and chorus. It's a vivid illustration that we serve a God that is greater than all, and that He is a God who can, in situations that appear hopeless. And the account of David and Goliath is in many ways a picture of real life for a child of God. It is an account of how God can use man to do the miraculous. And there's much instruction for God's people in the account. We want to read verses 12 through verse 18. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons, and the man went among men for an old man in the days of Saul. And the 3 eldest sons of Jesse went and followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons that went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next unto him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. But David went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening, and presented himself 40 days. And Jesse said unto David his son, Take now for thy brethren an ephah of this parched corn, and these 10 loaves, and run to the camp to thy brethren, and carry these 10 cheeses unto the captain of their 1,000, and look how thy brethren fare, and take their pledge. Now Saul and, well, we'll stop there. So, what we have here leads into the account of David and Goliath. What we've just read is rarely mentioned in the account of David defeating Goliath, but it is a part of it. And it is almost never, if ever, emphasized. Yet, what we read here is what brought David to this Goliath moment. In our text, in verses 12 through 18, there's nothing spectacular there. No great drama. Nothing really riveting or exciting. And therefore, these verses are often passed over without any consideration when one is considering the account of David defeating Goliath. But again, what we read here is a part of that account. It explains how David arrived at the place where the Philistines and Israel were facing each other in war. In the account of David defeating Goliath, without a doubt, David was greatly used of God. Greatly used of God. But when most read the text leading into the magnificent event of David defeating Goliath, they see nothing significant about David. But what we read here reveals a very important principle when it comes to being used of God. If I were to ask, do you want to be mightily and miraculously used of God? Most here would answer without any hesitation, without any thought, yes, most certainly, that'd be great. If I were to ask, do you desire the opportunity to be greatly used of God in a great way? Again, most here, if not all, would answer, of course. That would be wonderful. Again, our text reveals a very important and often overlooked and underappreciated principle of being greatly used of God. In our text, before David and Goliath face off, David, in verses 17 and 18, is sent forth by his father on what most would consider a menial errand. By menial, I do not mean unimportant, but something that is of a humble service, not highly esteemed. But it was this service that brought David into this Goliath moment. This is such an important detail concerning the account of David and Goliath. And it's almost always overlooked. Our subject is serving the Lord in the menial. Serving the Lord in the menial. We need to take the position of a servant. By way of background to our text, back in chapter 15, the Lord announced to Samuel that he had rejected Saul as king. This greatly discouraged Samuel. We read in chapter 16 and verse 1, "And the Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel?" That is, Samuel, how long are you going to be depressed about this? And then God instructed Samuel to fill thine horn with oil and go. I will send thee to Jesse. I will send thee to Jesse, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Samuel questioned God, and God would give him further instruction. Samuel was to call for a sacrifice. He was to invite Jesse and his sons, and it would be one of these sons that God would have him to anoint to be the next king in Israel. In verses 6 through 10 of chapter 16, 7 of Jesse's sons, remember he had 8, 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. And the Lord repeatedly said to Samuel, as each one passed by, "Not this one. This is not the one." All 7 pass. This led Samuel to ask Jesse in 1 Samuel 16:11, "Do you have any other sons?" And it was at this point that Jesse mentions his youngest son, David. And he said, "He keepeth the sheep. He's out shepherding the flock." What was David doing? He was serving. He was being faithful in what was considered a lowly position at that time. You couldn't get a lower position. A shepherd. Well, David would be brought before Samuel. And in verse 12 of 1 Samuel 16, the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he. This is he. This is him." Who would have thought? Who would have thought? We read in verse 13 that Samuel anointed David to be the next king. And then we read, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. The Spirit of God is upon him. David is unlike anyone else at this point. We then read in verse 14 and 15 concerning Saul, that an evil spirit came from the Lord that troubled him. Saul's servants suggested that they bring in someone who could play the harp and perhaps soothe Saul. It was at this point that someone mentioned that David, the shepherd, he can skillfully play the harp. So Saul's messengers say to Jesse, verse 19, "Send me David thy son." And notice what Jesse, the father of David, said, or what was said here concerning David, which is with the sheep. There he is, still serving. He's the future anointed king of Israel. Has the Spirit of God upon him, and there he is, still serving, shepherding the sheep. And then notice verse 21, "And David came to Saul and stood before him." Takes the position of a servant. Saul ended up loving David and made him his armor bearer. And whenever Saul became discouraged, whenever he became troubled in spirit, we read there in verse 23 that David would take his harp and play with his hand, and Saul was refreshed and well. Again, the future anointed king in a position of a servant. He has the self-sacrificing, the self-denying, the self-giving spirit of service. Coming to chapter 17, we see the armies of the Philistines, the armies of Israel on mountains on opposite sides of the valley of Elah. And they're ready to go to war. And in verse 4, we're told about this Philistine giant. His reputation was that of a conqueror. And he steps forth to conquer. Remember where David is. He's out shepherding the sheep. In verse 8, "And he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel." He's taunting them. He's challenging them. Notice the effect. Verse 11. "When Saul and all Israel heard those words of Philistines, they were dismayed." They were horrified. They became very unsettled, very disturbed. They're alarmed, they're distressed. And it says, "and greatly afraid." That is, they're scared, they're terrified. It was a very perilous time for Israel. The entire nation was being threatened. Then comes verse 12. First two words. "Now David." Now David. All that was going on. Now David. And then in verses 13 and 14, there is record of Jesse's sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, following Saul into war. And then we come to verse 15. "But David." But David. And then it is told that David had left the palace and had returned to shepherding his father's sheep. Nothing magnificent, nothing spectacular, just faithfulness in a small matter. Again, the future anointed king of Israel in the position of a servant. While all that was going on, Goliath, had already stood before the Israelites morning and night for 40 days, 80 times. In verse 17 and 18, David was sent by his father on what would be considered, in the light of the big picture, in the light of the war that was going on, a menial errand. He's not being sent to fight in the battle, but Jesse simply told David, you bring them some lunch. That's what I want you to do. He didn't say to David, here's some weapons. You go down and help your brothers in this warfare. No, he said, David, here's some corn. Here's some bread. Here's some cheese. And you go down and give these to your brothers. And I want you to take notice of how the battle is going. And then you come back and let me know. Comparatively to what his brothers were doing, this was a very small task. This was a very menial task. But David could be trusted with it. David could be trusted with this so-called menial task. Now, many in David's position, again, he's a future anointed king, they would have said, Dad, why don't you get someone else to do that? Don't you know I'm the next king? Someone else can bring them lunch. Or maybe he could have said, they should have brought sufficient supplies. It's not my fault. They didn't plan far enough ahead. Why should I have to do that? Or someone else, or he might say, get someone else to bring their lunch. Or, I want to fight in the battle. I don't want to just bring them lunch. But we read in verse 20, and David rose up early in the morning and went as Jesse had commanded him. And there he is again, taking the lowly position of a servant. And David rose up early in the morning. He was eager for this menial service. It was something that anyone could do. But he was willing. And he was ready to serve in whatever capacity was necessary. Didn't have to be something that was considered great or exciting. Jesse simply said to David's son, you bring them some lunch and report back to me. And David rose up early in the morning. He's eager. He's willing to minister to others. He's a future anointed king. But he humbled himself for menial service. He humbled himself to minister to others in the menial. He had the mindset of true service. You think about David. He's an incredible individual when you think about David. He was a shepherd. He was a musician. He was a composer. Wrote most of the Psalms. He was a writer. He was a soldier. He was a king. He was a military genius. He was a great administrator. But those are not the things that made David one of the most remarkable characters in the Word of God. He was a man of extraordinary talents and extraordinary abilities. He was a man of high rank. He had many great accomplishments. But that's not what made David one of the most influential men in the history of the world. But David was a man who had experienced God's amazing grace. And he took the position of a servant. That was David. And that's what made David so great. He simply took the position of a servant. So I want to consider a proper attitude and a proper spirit concerning menial service. In our text, again, in the events prior to our text, which we've reviewed, there's David, serving in what many would consider menial tasks. But that's where you found him. The anointed future king. He's in a position of a servant. And if we're going to truly serve the Lord, we must get in the position of a servant. And we must be content to serve in the so-called small matters. Jesus is our example. He's the model servant. And when you look at the earthly ministry of Christ, it was marked by so-called menial service. He's God. He's God in a body of humble human flesh. God on earth. Matthew 20, verse 28, we hear him say, "The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister." That's remarkable. That's amazing. He's our example. He's God. And He's here. He was there to serve. In Luke 22:27, Jesus says, "I am among you as he that serveth." And in John 13, we see Jesus girded with towel. God in the flesh, girded with towel, washing the dirty feet of the apostles. A work that any one of them could have done and should have done. A work that did not require a specific skill set, but each of the apostles, they walked right past that basin. They walked right past that towel, perhaps with no thought at all, or perhaps thinking, there should be someone here to wash my feet. That was the custom of the day. I wonder why. I wonder why there's no one here to wash my feet. Somebody has failed. Jesus. Any one of them could have done it. After they sat at the table, Jesus stands up, girds himself with a towel, and begins to wash their feet. Menial service, humble service. No specific skill set whatsoever. One did not have to be gifted to do this. There's John the Baptist. he also is an example of a right attitude, a right perspective concerning so-called menial service. We hear him say concerning Christ in Matthew 3, verse 11, whose shoes I am not worthy to bear or carry. And in Mark 1, verse 7, whose shoes I am not worthy to stoop down and to unloose. And in Luke 3:16, whose shoes I am not worthy to unloose. That was the responsibility of the lowest of servants, to carry his master's sandals, to stoop down and unloose his master's sandals. And John says, I'm not worthy to do that. I'm not worthy to do the lowest of service. Why did John say that? What caused John to say that? Well, he had an understanding of the person of Christ and His greatness. He had an understanding of how great Jesus Christ was. He also had an understanding of His own person, who He was, and His own unworthiness. So he had a high opinion or high thoughts upon Christ, low opinion of himself. And what one thinks of Christ and what one thinks of themselves go hand in hand. You can mark it down. A man who has a high opinion of himself has a low opinion of Christ. Mark it down. Hear him say, I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy. John's view of service to the Lord was, I'm not worthy. I'm not deserving to be the lowest servant in the household. To stoop, to unloose Christ's shoes, and to bear them might seem as if it involved the loss of all self-respect. For a man of position, and John the Baptist was a man of position, a man of influence. But John said, I'm not worthy. John fully realized that he was unworthy to perform the lowest of service. And therefore, if that is so, then it is an honor to serve Him in any capacity. If it is so that we are unworthy to serve the Lord in the lowest capacity, if that is so, then this is so also. It is an honor to serve Him in any capacity. Do we realize that? Do we realize that? John was willing to do whatever the Lord would have him to do. But at the same time, he realized, I'm unworthy. I don't deserve to do anything for the Lord. And as we've said before, if anything can be done for Christ, for His honor, for His glory, whatever that may be, you and I don't deserve to do it. We don't deserve such a privilege. It's too good for us to do. If it can be done for the honor and glory of the Lord, we'll never be deserving of being allowed to do it. Though we're always unworthy, we ought to always be willing and ready and thankful. I've had people use that. Could you do such and such? Well, brother, I really feel unworthy to do that. Well, you are unworthy, but you ought to be willing. And if you're not, your word unworthy, just say, I'm too lazy, or I don't want to. We're unworthy. We're unworthy, but we ought to be willing. We ought to be ready. And we ought to be thankful that we can serve God in the smallest of matters. Some may consider it dishonorable to stoop, to unloose, to bear the shoes of Christ. But again, if Christ can be honored by it, how can it be a dishonor to us? How can it possibly be a dishonor? It's not possible for any godly work to be beneath our dignity, because we're not worthy. Even the most obscure form of service, noticed by no one, is higher and more lofty than we are worthy to undertake. That truth needs to get a hold of us. Since any form of service to the Lord is too good for us to do, how grateful we ought to be for every opportunity to serve the Lord. Well, I'm too gifted to do that. Since any form of service for the Lord is too good for us to ever deserve, how we ought to perform every service with love, with humility, with thanksgiving, with zeal, with determination. I'm going to glorify God in this, and I'm going to give my best effort because it's for Him. It's His service. So back to David. He was a remarkable man. One of the most prominent figures in Bible history. He is mentioned over 1,000 times in the Bible. One of the most prominent figures in Israel's history. One of the most prominent figures in world history. Again, he is a man who has experienced God in his life. As a result, he has a heart for God, and he has a desire to do God's will. And it's recorded in Acts 13, verse 36, that David served his own generation by the will of God. That is, he served God's will and purpose in his own generation. That's what that's saying. As a man, like ourselves, he had varying circumstances and conditions. David knew what it was to be wealthy, and he knew what it was to be in poverty. And he was willing to serve in either. He knew what it was to be a king. He knew what it was to be a fugitive. And his desire was to serve God either way. He knew what it was to be loved. He knew what it was to be hated without a cause. And he served God either way. He knew what it was to have joy. And he knew what it was to have sorrow. He served God either way. Didn't matter. You just cannot say, honestly, well, I'm going through a rough time here. Maybe some other time I'll be able to serve, but right now I can't. Really? You're a servant. You're a servant. You serve when you're called upon. He knew what it was to have victory. He knew what it was to have defeat. He simply wanted to serve either way. He knew what it was to have confident assurance. Read the Psalms. He knew what it was to be fearful. He knew what it was to be overwhelmed with burdens and stress. He's willing to serve. As a man, he passed through many trials, had many calamities in his life, many distresses in his life, many difficulties, many troubles. But he served. As a man, he was not perfect. We very well know that. Committed some grievous sins. He was not perfect. But he wanted to serve. He was not without flaw. None of us are. He was not without spot or defect. David had defects all over him, just like you and I. But he could still serve. He was not everything he should have been. He was not everything he could have been. And we can review our lives. And none of us have ever been everything we should be and everything we could be. It's never happened. It's not going to. But you can't use that as an excuse not to serve God. I believe God knew you were imperfect when He called you to serve. David just served God, even in the menial. It was serving God in the menial that brought him this opportunity to serve God in a miraculous way. A lot of people want to serve God in a miraculous way, to be greatly used, that'll have an impact. But I believe first, we have to be willing to serve Him in a way that no one else notices and very few appreciate. Again, it's Mother's Day. That is a characteristic mark of a mother. They serve in the menial. They serve in the menial. They're just the little things that, you look back on your childhood, just the little things. Just the little things. But they were willing. Didn't matter if the children noticed it or not. Most children don't. They're too self-involved to notice, to pay any attention. That's how we're to be. We're to be willing to serve God in the things that seem to be insignificant. And you look back on your childhood and you think of your mom. And many times the things that are most meaningful and impactful to us now were those insignificant things. Just small things. That's how we're to be in our service to God. We should be intent on pleasing God in everyday matters. Again, take that mother. Her intent is to meet the needs of her children. Doesn't matter what she has to do that. She's going to do it. It should be our intent of just pleasing God in everyday matters. Someone will say, well, that's not that important. Well, it may not be, but it really is. Because you're to serve God in that. There are no unimportant matters. It needs to be our aspiration to please Him in the everyday matters. But Burdine, you don't understand. I want to be used in a miraculous way. You need to just please God in the everyday matters. And you might be surprised what opportunity that brings you. Just being faithful in the everyday matters. There's David, being faithful and bringing his brothers some lunch. And all the opportunity that David was brought into. We need to view life as an opportunity to serve Him. A lot of things happen we don't like, we wouldn't have chosen, but we ought to view it, this isn't what I would have chosen, this isn't what I would have desired, but how can I serve God in it? That's what it's all about. God help us. We need to be a people moved to serve God. That's our life. To serve, again, is to subject ourselves to the desire of another. That is true in human relationships. That is especially true with regards to our relationship to the Lord. Subject ourselves to the desires of God. I'm telling you, there is no better way to live. No better way to live than to subject ourselves to the will of God. There's nothing that will bring greater happiness and peace than subjecting ourselves to God. So God help us to be willing, to be ready, to serve God in what many would call menial matters. Brother Dave, if you'd come and lead us again in verse of song, we'll again stand.